He carried the same photo in his wallet for 50 years. Today, he finally shared the story. He carried the same photo in his wallet for 50 years, never once thinking of getting rid of it. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Every time he opened his wallet, it was the first thing he saw, the edges soft and worn from years of being folded over and over again. The photo had faded some, but it still held that quiet, strong presence. The way she smiled, the way her eyes seemed to look past the camera, like she was seeing something else in that moment. He never told anyone about it. Not once. Not even his wife, who had spent nearly 30 years with him. It was just something he kept tucked away, safe in the back pocket of his life. But today, his grandson, Ethan, asked a simple question that had never been asked before. "Why do you always carry that picture?" They were sitting at the kitchen table, just like they always did when Ethan visited after school. His coffee was already cooling in the cup, and the sun had started to slip behind the trees outside. It wasn't a moment that seemed any different from the others. Ethan had his homework spread out in front of him, the table littered with pencils and papers. He was still young, only 14, but already he had started to notice things, little details that the man didn't expect him to see, like the way he always carried that picture, and like the way, every now and then, he would touch the edges of his wallet as if it reminded him of something important. The question hung there between them, quiet for a second, before the man realized he wasn't going to brush it off. He glanced down at his wallet, which was sitting on the edge of the table, where it always was. For a long time, he hadn't thought about what was inside it, but when Ethan asked, the weight of it seemed to make the room feel stiller. The picture had been there for so long, it was almost like part of him. But it wasn't a part he talked about. It wasn't a part anyone knew about. His fingers hovered over the wallet for a moment, then he slid it open and pulled out the picture. He didn't hand it to Ethan. He just held it in his hand, looking at it for a second, and then set it down on the table between them. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes widening as he looked at the photo. It was of a woman, young, probably around the same age the man was now. Her hair was dark, wavy, and her smile was warm but slightly shy, like she wasn't sure if she should be smiling at the camera or something else. The background was blurred, but it looked like a park. Trees, sunlight filtering through the branches. Ethan picked it up carefully, like it might crumble in his hands. "Who's this?" The man felt the familiar tightness in his chest. It wasn't that he was unwilling to talk. It was just that after all these years, it felt strange to finally put the memory into words. He had carried the photo all this time, and for so long, it had just been his. Just a quiet piece of something he'd never shared. Now, sitting across from his grandson, something made him want to answer. "That's Julia," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "She was someone I knew a long time ago." Ethan studied the photo for a moment, then looked up, his brow furrowed. "Someone you knew? You never talk about her." The man shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of how heavy the years had gotten. He had carried the photo so long that it had almost become a part of his silence. He didn't know where to begin, but he knew he had to say something. "She was a lot of things. A good friend. Someone I cared about," he said, trailing off. "I met her when I was in college. We were both at the same school, but we didn't really talk much at first." Ethan didn't interrupt, just listened. "There's a lot I never told anyone about her," the man continued, his eyes on the photo. "Not because it wasn't important, but because, well, sometimes things are easier left unsaid." He paused, unsure of how much to say. The years he had spent holding the photo, keeping it close without letting anyone see it, now felt like something he had to explain, something that had been a part of him for so long, something that now, in this small kitchen, with his grandson sitting across from him, finally had a place to go. "I've carried this photo with me for 50 years, he said softly, because it was the only part of her I had left, the only part I could keep." Ethan looked at him, his expression softening. "What happened?" The man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those years finally starting to lift, just a little. "I'll tell you someday," he said, a faint smile crossing his face. "But not today. It's a long story, one that's hard to tell in just a few words." Ethan nodded slowly, setting the photo down on the table. "Whenever you're ready, Grandpa." The man nodded too, finally feeling like he could let go of a little piece of the silence that had held the story in place for so long. Maybe it wasn't time to tell the whole story, but today, for the first time in 50 years, he shared just enough. And that was enough for now. The next day, Caleb found himself walking to the park with the photo still heavy in his pocket. It felt like it was waiting for him to pull it out again, like there was something else left unsaid. He wasn't sure what exactly. Maybe it was the quiet weight of the story. Maybe it was the way the photo had stayed with him all these years without ever being shared. When he reached the bench, he saw the man already sitting there, coffee in hand, staring out at the quiet park. The leaves on the trees were turning now, the crisp fall air making the ground cover in a thin layer of gold. The man didn't seem to notice Caleb approaching at first. He was still, almost too still, like he wasn't quite part of the world that moved around him. Caleb hesitated before sitting down beside him, wondering if he should say something, or if silence would be enough. He hadn't expected to feel like this, like the photo had opened a door to something that had been closed for a long time. "You didn't say much yesterday," Caleb finally said, glancing at the man. The man didn't look at him at first, but after a beat, he turned his head slightly. His eyes were softer than usual, but there was a quiet strength in them that Caleb hadn't noticed before. "I didn't," the man said slowly. "There are things you don't talk about, things you don't say, because you don't know if you're ready to say them, or if the time will ever come." Caleb nodded, unsure how to respond. He hadn't expected the answer to sound so final, so certain. He could feel the weight of the words, even though they were simple. He wasn't sure if he was ready to understand what the man meant, but it made him want to sit in the quiet for just a little longer. "I've kept that photo with me for 50 years, the man continued, his voice even but carrying the kind of weight that made Caleb sit up straighter. "It's not just because of the memories. It's because it's the only piece of her I have left. And even if it's the smallest part, it's still enough to remind me of what we had." Caleb looked down at the photo, which the man had slipped back into his wallet that morning. He hadn't asked to see it again, but he could feel it. This quiet, unspoken bond between the man and the woman in the picture. He wasn't sure if it was something he would ever fully understand, but sitting there with the man, listening to the story unfold in bits, felt like the beginning of something bigger than just one memory. "I don't think I could ever carry a photo of someone like that," Caleb said, half to himself. "Not if I didn't have the rest of them." The man's eyes flicked toward him, and there was a glimmer of something, understanding or recognition, maybe both. "You don't always get the whole picture," he said. "Sometimes it's just one part, one moment, but it's enough. Enough to remind you that there was something real there." Caleb wasn't sure how to respond to that. The idea that a single moment, a single photo, could carry all the weight of a lifetime felt foreign. But somehow, Sitting on the bench beside the man, it made more sense than it had the day before. It wasn't just about the photo, it was about what the photo represented, what it kept alive. "Did you ever think about moving on?" Caleb asked after a while. He didn't know why the question came up, but it felt like one that needed to be asked. The man paused before answering, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. "Sometimes," he said, his voice quiet. "But moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It just means learning to live with the parts that stay with you, the parts you can't leave behind." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. He had always thought of moving on as something you did when you were ready, something you chose. But it seemed like the man had made his peace with the idea long ago. Maybe he hadn't forgotten, but he had made room for the things that had stayed with him. "I think I get it," Caleb said, even though he wasn't sure he did. But he felt like he was starting to. The man turned to him then, his face softening just a little. "You will, when the time comes." They sat in the quiet for a while, and this time, Caleb didn't feel the need to fill the space. He just sat beside the man, letting the moment stretch out. The photo was still tucked away in his pocket, but now it felt like part of something bigger, something he wasn't sure he was ready to fully understand, but something he knew he would carry with him, just like the man carried his own memories. After a while, Caleb stood up. "I should get going," he said, his voice quieter than before. The man nodded slowly. "Take care, Caleb." Caleb gave him a small smile. "You too." As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something in him, something in the man, something in the way they shared the silence. It wasn't a big moment, not a moment that would change everything. But it was enough. Enough to keep the photo in the man's wallet, enough to keep their stories going. And somehow, that felt like more than enough. The next few days felt different for Caleb. It wasn't just about the photo anymore. It was the weight of the conversation, the quiet understanding that had passed between him and the man on the bench. He hadn't expected to feel this way. He had walked away from that conversation thinking there was so much more to it, but not knowing what to ask. The man had shared something so deeply personal, and Caleb hadn't known how to fully grasp it. But when he sat down on the bench again, the following Tuesday, he found himself looking at the spot beside him, wondering if the man would be there again. It wasn't about the photo now. It wasn't even about what had been said. It was the idea that some stories were meant to be shared slowly, over time. And maybe this was the start of one of those stories. When Caleb arrived, the man was already sitting there. His coffee mug was in hand, the same worn silver one, the steam rising from it into the cool morning air. The park was quieter today. The leaves on the trees had thinned out, the colors changing fast as the weather grew colder. It felt like the world was in the middle of shifting, and there was something about it that made the air feel heavier. The man looked up when he heard Caleb approach. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, like he had been expecting him. "Morning, Caleb," he said, his voice as steady as always. "Morning," Caleb replied, sitting down beside him, just like he had the week before. He didn't have a question in mind, not yet. But as he settled in, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more needed to be said. Not just about the photo, not just about the past, but about what the man had shared with him that day. "You said she was the only part of your past you had left," Caleb said, looking at the man. "What happened to her?" The question wasn't easy to ask. Caleb wasn't sure if the man would even answer it, but he had to ask. It felt like the last piece of the puzzle was missing. The photo, the man's quiet presence. It all made sense in pieces. but there was a piece he still didn't understand. The man was quiet for a long moment. He didn't look at Caleb. He just stared ahead, out at the park, like he was sorting through memories that weren't easy to revisit. "She left," the man said, his voice lower than usual. "She left, and I never asked why. I never got the chance. I didn't know what to say to her, and before I could figure it out, she was gone." Caleb sat back, letting the words sink in. The park around them felt still, the silence between them stretching longer than usual. He could feel the weight of what the man was saying, the unspoken truth that had been hanging in the air since the first day they spoke. "What do you mean? She just left? No explanation?" Caleb asked, his voice quiet. The man finally turned his head, looking at Caleb. His eyes weren't sad. They weren't angry. Just steady. "She left without saying goodbye. Without anything. One day she was here, and the next, she was gone. And I didn't chase after her. I thought maybe it was just one of those things. That she'd come back." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. He couldn't imagine someone just leaving like that. No closure. No explanation. The thought of it felt unfinished, like a story with no ending. "But she promised she'd come back," the man continued, his voice almost a whisper. "She said she'd be back, and I carried this photo because I thought, if I had this, maybe she'd come back. Maybe it would remind her of what we had." Caleb looked at the photo, now sitting between them on the bench. He hadn't seen it in the same light before. He had always thought of it as a relic, something the man carried for nostalgia's sake. But now, it felt like more than that. It was a symbol of something the man had lost, something he couldn't let go of. "But she never came back," Caleb said softly. "No," the man said, his voice steady now, but with a kind of finality that Caleb couldn't ignore. "She didn't, and I never asked her why. I couldn't. I didn't know how to. But I've carried this photo, kept it in my wallet, because maybe it was enough. Maybe it was all I needed." Caleb thought about that for a moment. He wasn't sure if he could ever understand what it was like to carry something so heavy for so long. But sitting here with the man, it was clear that the weight of that loss had shaped him in ways Caleb didn't yet fully understand. "It's been 50 years, Caleb said, almost to himself. The man nodded, looking down at the photo. 50 years, and I never let go of it." They sat in silence for a while. Caleb didn't know what to say, and the man didn't seem to expect him to say anything. They just sat there, side by side, as the morning light spread over the park, the world still moving around them. Finally, Caleb spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You think she ever thought about you? After all this time?" The man looked out at the park, his gaze distant again. "I don't know, but I like to think she did. I like to think she remembered me." Caleb didn't press him for more. He didn't need to. The man had shared enough for one morning, enough for Caleb to realize that the photo wasn't just about the past. It was about the waiting, the hope, the part of the man that still believed, somewhere deep down, that things could be right again. For the first time, Caleb understood. Sometimes you don't move on. Sometimes you just hold on. The next time Caleb showed up, the man wasn't there. It wasn't like before. It wasn't just another morning when he was a little late, or a day when he happened to be busy elsewhere. It was a feeling, like something had shifted, and the space that had been shared on the bench wasn't as full. Caleb had gotten used to the quiet between them, the way the man sat, his coffee in hand, his thoughts never rushed. And now, Sitting there alone, Caleb realized how much that silence had become something he could rely on. He waited a while, longer than usual, thinking the man might just be running behind. But the park kept moving around him. Runners passed, families walked by with strollers, kids played at the swings. Still, no sign of the man. Caleb started to wonder if maybe something had happened. If the man had stopped coming for good. Maybe he had finally let go of whatever held him to the bench all these years. The thought felt strange. He didn't want to admit it, but he missed the old man's presence. There was something steady about him, something that made it easier to sit in the quiet. Now, the bench felt too open, too empty. After a while, Caleb stood up. He wasn't sure if he was walking away because the man wouldn't come, or because he was afraid he might not come back at all. Either way, Caleb found himself at the gate, the place where the path curved out of the park. He stood there for a few seconds, looking back over his shoulder at the bench, and then, almost without thinking, he turned and headed down the street. It was just a short walk before he saw the man, walking slowly toward the park. He looked different today, somehow. Maybe it was the weight of the silence between them, or maybe it was just that he had been absent for a while. The man had a slight hunch in his back, like he was carrying something heavier than usual. He was wearing a thick scarf, and his steps were a little slower, a little more deliberate. Caleb hesitated, then jogged over to meet him. "Hey," Caleb said when he was close enough. "I didn't think you were coming today." The man looked up, surprised at first, then smiled softly. "Didn't think I was either, but something about today made me want to." They walked together in silence for a while, toward the bench. It wasn't until they got there that the man stopped, looked at the empty seat, and sighed. "I didn't come yesterday," the man said, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't know if I was ready to come back." Caleb sat down, careful not to crowd him. Ready for what? The man looked at the ground for a moment before speaking. "I don't know. Maybe I just wasn't sure if I had anything left to say, or if I was still holding on to something I shouldn't." Caleb didn't push. He had learned by now that sometimes the man's words didn't come quickly. They were measured, like he was still working through them in his own mind. "I think it's okay to not know," Caleb said after a while. "You don't have to say anything." The man smiled at that. Maybe that's the hardest part, letting go of the need to say everything. Caleb glanced down at the ground. "I don't think you ever let go of it. I think you just learned to carry it differently." The man didn't say anything right away, but Caleb could see him thinking, processing the words. It wasn't an answer, but it felt like something had shifted. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt like a shared space, a space that didn't need to be filled with words. For a while, they both just sat there, watching the park wake up. The first jogger came by, followed by a woman with a dog. A few families filtered in, but Caleb and the man stayed in their own quiet bubble, letting the world move around them without feeling like they needed to be a part of it. "I think," the man said after a long while, breaking the silence, "that I've been waiting for something that wasn't coming back. And I think that's okay." Caleb turned to look at him, unsure of where the conversation had gone. "What do you mean?" The man looked at him, his face softer now, like the years of holding something in had finally loosened. "I mean, sometimes you wait for people to come back, for things to return to the way they were. But what I've realized is that you don't need to wait anymore. You just have to make peace with the fact that it's okay to keep moving forward." Caleb felt the weight of that. The man wasn't just talking about waiting for someone who had left. He was talking about letting go of the past, of carrying something that didn't need to be carried anymore. The man stood up slowly, stretching his back and adjusting his coat. Caleb stood too, not sure if he was supposed to say something else or if the conversation had already ended. The man turned to him and smiled, a real smile this time. "I'm glad you came by today," the man said. "I'm glad we could talk." Caleb smiled back, though he still didn't know exactly what had shifted in the conversation. "Me too." As they walked away from the bench, Caleb glanced back at it one last time. The park was still quiet, the trees bare, but somehow it didn't feel as empty as it had before. Sometimes it wasn't about the answers. It was about sitting through the silence until you realized you were ready to let go. The morning started to feel a little easier for Caleb, even though he didn't know why. Maybe it was because the man had stopped carrying the weight of the past so heavily. Or maybe it was because Caleb had learned something in those quiet moments on the bench, something about listening, about waiting, about not needing to fill every second with words. It had been 2 weeks since they'd had that conversation, and the park felt different now. The man didn't seem like someone waiting anymore. He didn't seem burdened by the things he couldn't change. When Caleb arrived that Tuesday morning, the man was already sitting on the bench, his coffee mug in hand. But there was something lighter about him today. It wasn't just that he looked a little more at ease. It was the way he sat, like he wasn't waiting for anything, just content to be right where he was. Caleb sat down beside him without a word. They didn't need to speak. The park was calm. The trees were still bare, the air cool, but the tension between them had lifted. It wasn't gone, but it felt like it had found its place. The man turned to Caleb after a while, eyes bright, as if he had something to share. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that wasn't heavy anymore, just thoughtful. "Maybe I didn't give her enough credit, not just for what she gave me, but for what she didn't leave behind." Caleb looked over at him, confused for a moment. "What do you mean?" The man smiled faintly, looking down at his coffee. "For a long time, I held on to the idea that she left me with nothing, that I was left alone, without any closure. But I've started to realize that she left me something important, something I never noticed before." Caleb was quiet for a moment, letting the man speak in his own time. He didn't feel the need to interrupt or rush him. He understood now, in a way he hadn't before, that sometimes people just needed time to find the words that had been sitting with them for years. "She didn't leave me with an explanation," the man continued, his voice steady. "But she left me with the memory of what we had, and that's worth more than any explanation could have been." Caleb nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. He hadn't realized how much the man had been holding on to, how much weight he'd been carrying all this time. But now, listening to him, Caleb saw something different in the way the man held himself. It wasn't that he had forgiven her, or that he had forgotten. It was that he had found peace in the absence. He had found a way to make space for what remained. "I guess I never thought about it that way," Caleb said after a moment, looking at the park. "I always thought you had to get closure, to get the answers before you could move on." The man turned toward him, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe. But I think sometimes the answers aren't what you need. Sometimes it's about accepting what's left behind and making peace with that." Caleb looked at the man, something clicking in his mind. "It's not about closure. It's about letting go." The man's eyes brightened a little, as if Caleb had finally understood something he had been trying to explain all along. "Exactly." They sat there for a while, not saying anything else. Caleb looked out at the park, watching the trees sway in the breeze. There was something about the way the man had spoken that made everything seem clearer, like a piece of the puzzle he hadn't even known he was missing had finally clicked into place. The morning continued to unfold around them. More people passed by, more joggers, more families. But the bench felt different now. It felt like something shared, something that didn't need to be fixed or explained, just a place to sit, a place to be. After a while, the man stood up, stretching his legs slowly. Caleb followed suit, standing alongside him. There was no need for words now. They both understood that. "I think that's enough for today," the man said with a small smile, glancing at Caleb. "Sometimes the quiet says more than the words." Caleb smiled back, feeling something settle in his chest, something he hadn't expected. "Yeah," he agreed. "I think you're right." As they left the bench, Caleb took one last look back at it. The park hadn't changed. The trees were still bare. The ground was still covered with leaves. But something in the air felt different. Lighter, maybe. Not because everything had been fixed, but because they had found a way to sit with it, to make peace with it. And for the first time, Caleb understood that sometimes the most important conversations weren't the ones filled with words. They were the ones that could be shared in silence. The ones where you didn't need to ask for anything more. You just sat and let the moment be enough. The bench had become more than just a spot in the park. It had become a place where Caleb felt like he could breathe. It wasn't just about the man or the stories anymore. It was about the quiet that settled around him when he sat there. The way the world felt a little slower, a little less rushed. He started showing up every day, even when the man wasn't there. He'd sit on the bench, watch the park wake up, and just think. But on one particular morning, the man was already there when Caleb arrived, sitting on the same bench, his coffee mug in hand, eyes distant but not lost. Caleb sat down beside him without a word. It felt like the most natural thing in the world now, just sitting together without needing to speak. After a few minutes, the man turned to him, his eyes steady. "You've been coming a lot lately." Caleb nodded, unsure where the conversation would go. "I like it here," he said simply. "It's quiet. It's different." The man looked out at the park, where people were slowly starting to filter in. "It's funny," he said after a pause, "how something so simple can become a part of you." Caleb didn't answer right away. He had learned to sit in the quiet with the man, not feeling the need to rush to fill the space. There was something comforting about the way the man spoke. Slow, deliberate, like he wasn't waiting for anything to happen, just letting things unfold as they were. "Do you think you'll ever leave?" Caleb asked, his voice low. The man looked at him, then back at the park. "Leave the bench?" "Yeah," Caleb said. "Leave the park. Move on. Do something different." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't know. Maybe. But I think I'm meant to be here for a while. Not because I'm waiting for something, but because I've learned to be here, in the quiet." Caleb thought about that. The idea of just being somewhere without needing to chase after anything. He didn't have a good answer to that. Not yet. But the thought stayed with him. After a moment, the man added, "You get to a point where it's not about moving on. It's about accepting where you are and making peace with it." Caleb nodded slowly. It made sense. But it was hard to imagine doing that. He was still figuring out what peace even meant. It felt like something he'd have to grow into, like he wasn't quite ready for it yet. The conversation drifted into a comfortable silence again, and Caleb found himself just watching the park, watching the people walk by. There was something about the stillness of the man beside him, the way he didn't rush through life, that made Caleb feel like maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to rush either. "Do you miss her?" Caleb asked quietly, looking at the man. The question hung in the air. The man didn't look at him at first. He just took a slow sip from his mug, thinking. "I miss parts of her," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "But I don't know if I miss who she was when she left. I think I just miss the idea of who she was, the idea of what we could have been." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. The idea of someone being both present and absent in your life was something he hadn't really thought about before. But sitting there with the man, he could understand it in a way. It was like holding on to something that wasn't there anymore, trying to make sense of it. After a moment, Caleb spoke again, his voice quiet. "Is it ever hard, not knowing why she left?" The man nodded, but his gaze didn't waver from the park. "Sometimes, yes. But I've learned that I can't spend my life waiting for the answers I'll never get. Some things don't get fixed, and that's okay. Sometimes you just learn to live with the parts that don't make sense." Caleb sat back, letting the weight of the man's words settle. It wasn't an easy thing to learn, he realized. To accept the things you couldn't fix, the questions you couldn't answer. But maybe it was what he had been missing all along. The peace of letting go of the need for everything to make sense, for everything to have a clear answer. He didn't have all the answers. Not yet. And maybe that was okay. For the rest of the morning, they didn't speak much. The park filled up with more people, some familiar faces, some new. But Caleb wasn't in a hurry to leave. He wasn't in a hurry to understand everything either. He just sat beside the man, letting the quiet fill the spaces between them. As the sun climbed higher, Caleb stood up, feeling like he had taken in everything he needed for the day. "I should get going," he said. The man nodded. "Take care, Caleb. You know where to find me." Caleb smiled. "I'll be back tomorrow." And for the first time, he realized that the bench didn't just belong to the man. It didn't just belong to the past. It belonged to the present, to the space between stories and the moments they shared. It was a place where things didn't need to be figured out, where silence was enough. Caleb walked away, feeling lighter than he had before. Maybe it wasn't about moving on. Maybe it was just about letting things be, about letting the quiet have its place. And for the first time, he felt like he could do that. It had been a few weeks since Caleb had started sitting with the man at the bench every morning. The mornings had started to blur together in a way that felt comfortable, predictable even. The man was always there when Caleb arrived. His coffee cup always held the same warmth, the steam rising from it in the cold morning air. The routine was easy, but there was something else that Caleb couldn't quite put his finger on. The park had started to feel different, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle shift that Caleb couldn't ignore. The sounds of the park, the footsteps on the gravel paths, the rustling of leaves in the trees, felt more like part of him now. There was no rush to get anywhere, no reason to hurry through it all. It was just a quiet space that had begun to feel like home. But that morning, something was different. The bench was empty when Caleb arrived. He stood there for a second, unsure if the man was late or if something had happened. He looked around the park, as if expecting to find him walking toward him, but the man wasn't there. Caleb sat down on the bench alone, the space next to him empty in a way that made the park feel quieter than it had in weeks. It wasn't like he hadn't been alone before, but today felt different. There was an unsettling weight to the quiet. Maybe it was because he had gotten used to the man being there, sitting beside him, sharing the silence. Maybe it was because Caleb had started to realize that the man had become a constant in his life, a reminder that some things don't need to be fixed, that sometimes you just sit with it. He waited for about half an hour, watching as people passed by, but still no sign of the man. No slow walk toward the bench. No familiar voice greeting him with a simple, "Good morning." After a while, Caleb decided to leave. He stood up and started walking toward the path that led out of the park. He wasn't sure what to do with the emptiness he felt sitting on the bench. He didn't think he needed the man's presence to fill the silence, but for the first time, it felt like the park was just a park. Without the man, it didn't have the same meaning. As he reached the gate, Caleb saw the man walking toward him. He was moving slowly, his hands in his pockets, his eyes on the ground. He looked different today, more tired, more worn. But there was something in the way he moved that made Caleb stop, made him wait. The man looked up when he noticed Caleb, his expression softening when their eyes met. He didn't smile, but there was a sense of relief in the way he held himself. "I didn't think you were coming today," Caleb said, his voice low. The man shook his head slowly. "I wasn't sure if I should." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The man sighed, glancing down at the bench as if considering whether or not to sit. He walked toward it and lowered himself down, looking out at the park. "There are days when it feels like it's better to stay away," he said quietly, "like the silence is too heavy, too much to carry." Caleb sat down beside him, not knowing exactly what to say. He didn't want to push, but the words felt like they were hanging in the air between them. The man had shared so much with him already, but today there was a distance, a hesitation that Caleb couldn't quite understand. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about," the man continued, his voice steady, but with a trace of something Caleb couldn't place. "About moving on. About letting go of the things you can't fix." Caleb nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I think I've been holding on to the past for too long," the man said after a moment, his voice quieter now. "It's like carrying something heavy, something that doesn't belong in the present anymore. And I don't know if I'm ready to let it go." Caleb didn't interrupt. He understood that feeling, that hesitation. Sometimes it was harder to move forward than it seemed. Sometimes you held on to things just because they were all you had. "But maybe," the man added, glancing at Caleb, "maybe I don't need to carry it anymore." The words hung there between them, and for the first time, Caleb realized that the man wasn't just talking about the photo or the past. He was talking about something deeper, something that Caleb couldn't yet fully grasp, but something that felt like it was changing the way the man saw himself. "I don't know if I'll ever fully let go," the man said, his voice almost a whisper. "But maybe I don't need to. Maybe it's enough to accept it for what it was and let it be part of me, without carrying it around all the time." Caleb sat quietly, not sure what to say. He could feel the weight of the man's words, the shift that had occurred without him even realizing it. The bench, the park, the quiet. It wasn't just a place to sit anymore. It was a place where things were changing, a place where the past could exist without taking up too much space. "I think," Caleb said slowly, "you've already let go more than you think." The man didn't respond right away. He just sat there, looking at the park, his gaze distant but calm. Caleb realized then that the man didn't need to explain everything. He didn't need to tell every part of the story. It was enough that they had shared this space, this quiet, together. After a while, the man stood up. He didn't look at Caleb, but there was a softness in the way he moved, like something had been settled. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, his voice steady again. Caleb nodded, watching the man walk away, feeling the change in the air between them. He didn't know exactly what had shifted, but he felt like something important had just happened. Something unspoken, but enough to change the way they both moved through the world. The bench was still empty, but it didn't feel as lonely anymore. The park didn't need to be filled with words. Sometimes, just sitting in the quiet was enough. The man didn't show up the next day. Caleb didn't know why, but it felt different this time. He'd gotten used to the routine. The man's steady presence, the quiet conversations, even the days when words weren't needed. It had all become part of the rhythm of his mornings. But today, as Caleb walked toward the bench, the space beside him felt empty in a way it hadn't before. He sat down slowly, looking around the park. The leaves had almost completely fallen from the trees now, the ground covered in golden and brown hues. The air had a chill to it, but it wasn't the cold that made him feel unsettled. It was the absence. The man had been such a constant presence that Caleb hadn't realized how much he had come to rely on him, even without understanding all of it. For the first time in weeks, Caleb found himself alone on the bench. He wasn't sure what to do with the silence, so he just sat there, watching the world go by. It was the same park, the same sights, the same sounds, but something was missing. He stayed there longer than he intended. The usual joggers passed by. A couple with a dog stopped by the fountain for a few minutes. The world around him moved on as it always did, but Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just about the man. It was about everything he had come to understand through those quiet mornings. Maybe it wasn't about needing answers. Maybe it was about learning to sit with what you had, with the parts that didn't make sense. As Caleb stood up to leave, he glanced at the empty spot on the bench one more time. He couldn't help it. There was something about the way the park looked without the man there. The bench seemed like it had lost its purpose, as if it were waiting for something that wasn't coming. Caleb didn't understand why he felt that way. It wasn't just about the man. It was about the space they had shared. And now, it felt like something was incomplete. The next morning, Caleb arrived at the park a little later than usual. He still wasn't sure why the man had been absent the day before. He thought about calling, but he wasn't sure what he would say. Maybe it wasn't something that needed an explanation. When he walked up to the bench, the man was sitting there. For a moment, Caleb stopped, unsure if he should say anything. He hadn't expected the man to be back so soon, especially after the way the previous morning had felt. But the man looked up when he heard Caleb approaching, a small, almost relieved smile on his face. "Did you miss me?" he asked, his voice steady, but with an edge of something Caleb couldn't quite place. Caleb smiled, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. "I thought you weren't coming back." The man chuckled softly. "I wasn't sure I was, either." Caleb sat down beside him, but he didn't say anything right away. He had learned not to rush the quiet, not to fill it with unnecessary words. Today felt different. It felt like there was something more beneath the surface. Like the man was waiting for the right moment to speak, or maybe he just needed the space to gather his thoughts. "I've been thinking," the man said after a while, his eyes still on the park in front of them. "Sometimes I wonder if I've spent too much time in the past, holding on to things that don't really matter anymore." Caleb looked at him, trying to make sense of what the man was saying. "What do you mean?" The man turned to him, his gaze steady but not heavy. "I think I've been stuck in a story that doesn't have an ending. I've carried it for so long I forgot that I was the one still holding on to it. And maybe it's time to let it go." Caleb didn't know what to say. He didn't want to offer words of advice. He didn't feel qualified to give any. But there was something in the way the man said it that made Caleb realize how much he had been holding on to his own quiet burdens. Maybe it wasn't just the man who needed to let go of things. Maybe it was Caleb, too. I'm not saying it's easy, the man added, his voice lower now. But I think the hardest part is realizing you don't have to keep carrying it. You can put it down and still be okay. Caleb nodded slowly, the weight of the man's words settling in. It wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about moving on in the way he'd always thought about it. It was about letting things be what they were, without needing to control them, without needing to change them. I think I get that, Caleb said quietly. But I don't know if I'm ready to put down everything yet. The man looked at him then, his eyes understanding but not judgmental. You don't have to be ready. You just have to know that the option is there. For a while, neither of them spoke. The park around them continued its usual rhythm, the joggers, the families, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. But it didn't feel as noisy now. It didn't feel as urgent. They just sat in the quiet, both of them understanding that sometimes just being there was enough. Finally, the man stood up, stretching his back and looking down at the bench. He turned to Caleb, his expression a little softer than before. Maybe tomorrow, he said with a faint smile. Maybe we'll sit here again and not need to say anything at all. Caleb smiled back, standing up with him. Yeah, maybe. As they walked away from the bench together, Caleb felt the weight of the past lifting just a little. Not because it was gone, but because he didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Some things didn't need answers. Some things just needed the time to settle. And maybe, for the first time, Caleb understood that. The mornings had become familiar, almost comforting, but there was still something Caleb hadn't said. Something that had been on his mind ever since he first sat down beside the man on the bench. It wasn't a question, not exactly, but more like a thought he wasn't sure how to share. He didn't know what had changed over the past few weeks. It wasn't just that the man had stopped waiting for something to come back. It wasn't just that they had started talking more openly. It was the way the park had started to feel like more than just a place to pass through. It felt like a space where things could be left behind, where silence was no longer a burden, but something to embrace. That Tuesday morning, Caleb found himself walking to the park earlier than usual. He had been thinking about the conversation they had the day before, about letting go of things that no longer served a purpose. He had been holding on to so much of his own past, and while he didn't know if he was ready to let it all go, he felt like maybe it was time to start. The man had shown him that, even if you didn't have all the answers, you could still move forward. When he reached the bench, the man was already sitting there, his coffee cup resting in his hands. He looked up as Caleb approached, a faint smile on his face. "Morning," the man said, his voice steady, like it always was. "Morning," Caleb replied, sitting down beside him. He noticed the way the man's eyes seemed to linger on the park, like he wasn't just seeing it as it was, but seeing it for what it could be. They sat in silence for a while, watching the park come alive with the usual morning activity, the joggers, the dog walkers, the families coming in for their daily stroll. It was the same as it always was, but somehow it felt different, like the park itself had changed, like it had become part of their story too. "I've been thinking," the man said after a while, his voice quieter now, "about the past, about how much of it I've carried with me all these years." Caleb glanced at him, waiting for him to continue. He wasn't sure what the man meant, but he had learned by now that when the man spoke, it was worth listening. "The thing about holding on to the past," the man continued, "is that you don't always realize how much it weighs. You think it's just a memory, something from long ago, but it gets heavier over time. And you don't even notice it until you try to stand up and realize you can't move the way you used to." Caleb nodded slowly. He understood that. He had carried his own burdens, things he wasn't sure how to let go of. The past had a way of creeping in when you least expected it, and before long, it felt like you were carrying the weight of everything that had ever happened to you. "I've been trying to let go of it," the man said, his voice a little softer now. "Not because I want to forget, but because I don't need to carry it anymore. It's not helping me move forward. It's just keeping me stuck." Caleb looked at the man, really looked at him for the first time in a way that felt like he was seeing him, not just as the quiet old man who sat on the bench, but as someone who had lived a life, who had loved and lost and kept going. And maybe that was the part Caleb hadn't understood until now. The man wasn't just sitting here because of the past. He was sitting here because he had chosen to live in the present, because he had learned to make peace with what had happened and move forward, even when it wasn't easy. "It's not easy, is it?" Caleb said quietly. The man shook his head. "No, it never is. But it's worth it." For the first time, Caleb felt like he understood what the man had been trying to say all along. It wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing it. It was about making room for the present. It was about not letting the things you couldn't change weigh you down. The man sat back, taking a slow sip from his coffee, and for a moment, Caleb just sat there with him, feeling the quiet between them. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just peaceful. "I think I'm starting to get it," Caleb said after a while, his voice softer now, like he was speaking to himself as much as to the man. "I've been holding on to a lot of stuff, things I don't know how to let go of." The man nodded, his gaze on the park in front of them. "You'll get there. You don't have to do it all at once." Caleb smiled, feeling something shift inside him. Maybe it wasn't about figuring everything out. Maybe it was about letting things unfold, about learning to carry only what you needed and leaving the rest behind. As the park around them continued to wake up, Caleb realized that he wasn't just learning to let go of the past. He was learning to be present, to accept the quiet, to let the silence be enough. They sat there for a while longer, not speaking, just watching the world go by. Caleb wasn't in a hurry to leave. He wasn't in a hurry to understand everything. He just wanted to be there, in the moment, with the man beside him, letting the day unfold as it would. Finally, the man stood up, stretching his legs and adjusting his coat. "I think I'll take a walk today," he said. "Get some air." Caleb stood up with him, not feeling the need to rush off. "I'll be here tomorrow," he said quietly. The man smiled. "I know." As they walked away from the bench, Caleb glanced back at it, feeling something settle in his chest. It wasn't just a bench anymore. It wasn't just a place to sit. It was a place where stories were shared, where silence was enough, and where letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant making space for what mattered now. And for the first time, Caleb understood that sometimes you didn't need to hold on to everything. Sometimes you just needed to sit, let things be, and move forward. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.